So this is the lecture on the spinal cord, and we have a couple of essential questions. The first one being, what is the structure of the spinal cord, and how is it protected from injury? So within a few minutes, you should be able to answer this question using all of these vocabulary words shown here. So let's start with, if you took a slice of the vertebral column, just like cut off one chunk of it, then you would see here is the bony vertebra. And then encased within it would be the spinal cord right here, and then the spinal nerves, which you can see are covered by this white covering, so that would be the meningeal layers, the dura mater, and so on. And then here is the spinal cord itself. So the spinal cord is the other component of the central nervous system. It's a two-way conduction pathway between the peripheral nervous system and the brain. And it's composed of neurons with really long axons. Some of them can be as long as your entire leg, right? They would go from your spinal cord all the way down the length of your leg, all the way to like your big toe. And your spinal cord is the reflex center where most of your spinal reflexes are determined. So things like the patellar reflex. If you get hit in the at the patellar tendon by a rubber mallet, then that sensory signal would go to your spinal cord, where an interneuron would then interface with a motor neuron to then cause your leg to kick outwards. The spinal cord is roughly 17 inches long. Obviously, that's going to depend on how tall you are. And it's going to start right here where the brain stem ends, and it's going to go all the way down to here. And then somewhere right here is where it is not really the spinal cord anymore, and instead it's just kind of these collections of spinal nerves that then continue on down your lower back and your pelvis. And then the spinal nerves then extend down your legs and things like that. Shh, I'm giving a lecture. Okay, so starting at, let's start with what are the pairs of the spinal nerves that come out from the regions of the spinal cord. So the first one would be the cervical spinal nerves, and there are 8 pairs of them. So you can see here's a pair right there from there to there. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pairs of spinal nerves going out to the left and the right sides of your body. And this is called the cervical, these are called the cervical spinal nerves because they go down the cervical region of your body, so the neck, essentially. Then you have the thoracic spinal nerves, and there are 12 pairs, which you can see here, going down your upper and middle back. And then you have 5 pairs that are the lumbar spinal nerves. And then starting right here at L2, L2 meaning the second pair of spinal nerves in the lumbar section, you've now reached the end of the spinal cord, and the rest of these are these free floating spinal nerves. And then last of all are the sacral nerves, and there are 5 pairs of those. The spinal nerves exit the vertebral column here, and then from there they just cascade down into, they almost kind of look like hairs in a horse's tail. So for that reason, they've been named the cauda equina. Cauda meaning back, and equina meaning horse. And they're covered by meninges for protection. And so as you guys saw here, you have these meninges, these white encasings, that protect the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, as well as, of course, the vertebra, the bones themselves. Okay, you know what? Take a second and just pause the video and see if you can answer this question using all of these terms. I just realized I left out the word spinal tap, which I know I addressed in a previous lecture, but a spinal tap is where you basically would insert a thin hollow needle into the cerebrospinal fluid that is protecting the spinal cord right around here. You'd remove some of that fluid, and then that spinal tap would allow you to assess if there are toxins or other bad things that could potentially compromise your brain or your spinal cord. Okay, the next essential question is, how does the structure of the spinal cord enable it to send messages from the body to the brain and from the brain to the body? So in a few minutes, I want you to return to this question and see if you can answer it using all of the vocabulary shown here. All right, so when you take a look at the spinal cord, what we've done here is we've removed we're imagining that we've removed the bony vertebra and we're just looking at the spinal cord itself. And so we're just looking at a section that has 3 pairs of spinal nerves. And this is what you would see. You would see when you took a cross section that there would be gray matter on the inside of the spinal cord and then white matter on the outside of the spinal cord, which is the opposite of what you saw in the brain, right? The brain had gray matter on the outermost regions, of the cerebrum, and then the white matter was deeper inside. So the gray matter here, it looks, I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but to me, this has always looked kind of like a bra. And so that's the gray matter there. And right there in the center of it is the central canal. And the central canal is going to allow cerebrospinal fluid to flow up and down the spinal cord. And then you have the white matter out here. Now let's start with the gray matter. The gray matter, just like in the brain, is the region that contains the soma of the neurons as well as all of the synapses between neurons. So the places where the axon terminals of one neuron synapses with the dendrites of the next neuron, those connections will be found here in this gray matter. And that means that because neurons are connecting here in this region, the gray matter is where they're going to receive info from the spinal nerve fibers that are coming into the spinal cord, and they're going to send motor information out through the spinal nerve fibers towards the effectors. So there are 2 terms that you need to know about when we talk about gray matter. The first are the posterior projections. So posterior means the back side. So this side of the spinal cord would be facing your back, and this side of the spinal cord down here would be facing all of your internal organs. So the posterior projections, to me, are kind of like the bra straps of the gray matter. And I've put triangles around them to show you. So we call these the posterior horns, or we call them the dorsal horns, because remember, dorsal means backside. We use the word posterior if the subject is standing upright. We use the word posterior if the subject is on all fours, like a cow or a pig. So what are these posterior projections for? They're the ones that are responsible for taking in sensory information that's coming in through the spinal nerves, processing that information, and then allowing it to then, take the next step to connect to interneurons or sending that information up to the brain for the brain to process it. Then the other terminology you should know are the anterior projections of the gray matter. These are called the ventral horns, ventral meaning belly, or anterior horns, anterior meaning the front side. And so these regions of the gray matter are responsible for sending out motor signals to the skeletal muscles to then trigger the skeletal muscles to contract or relax appropriately. So once again, you have sensory information coming through the spinal nerves here and being processed here, and then that's going to eventually trigger motor information to be processed here in the ventral horns and to go out through there, out through the spinal nerves to then trigger the effector skeletal muscles. Okay, next let's talk about the white matter. So the white matter is composed of not soma of neurons, not the synapses, but just the axons only. So these myelinated fiber tracts. And the reason why the white matter is white is because of all the myelin that protects the axons. And there are 3 regions of the white matter. There's the dorsal column here, or the posterior column. There's the ventral column, or the anterior column. And then on this side here and on this side here, there are the lateral columns. One thing I want you to notice is that I'm using the words posterior and dorsal interchangeably, both in my written stuff and when I verbally speak about this. And I'm also using the words anterior and ventral interchangeably. So beginning with the posterior or dorsal column. This is where you're going to find sensory tracts or afferent tracts. Tracts meaning bundles of axons in the central nervous system. So these tracts will conduct sensory impulses to the brain through the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. So here is the dorsal root, and then you'll notice that it has this bulge right here and right here. So that bulge is called the dorsal root ganglion, and this is where we're going to see the synapses for a lot of these sensory neurons. They're going to actually connect to additional neurons right in here. But what's going to happen is this is the dorsal branch of the spinal nerve once it branches to then connect to the spinal cord. So sensory information is coming through the dorsal root and then going up to the brain through the dorsal column of the white matter. In comparison, you have the anterior or ventral column, and you have the lateral white matter columns here. And these ones have both sensory or afferent tracts, and they also have motor and efferent tracts. So they're a mix of both kinds. And what they do is they bring in motor commands from the brain. So motor commands from the brain go down, down, down the spinal column and the ventral column here, and then are sent out through the ventral root. So you can see the ventral root of the spinal nerve. And then they go through the spinal nerve out to the skeletal muscles. And in addition, there are other fiber tracts. My kids were riding bikes and they just came back inside the house. And there are additional fiber tracts or fiber signals, axons, that are coming in from the dorsal side. Yeah, let me just finish this lecture. And then they're gonna go up to the brain through the lateral and ventral columns. And I made a mistake earlier when I was saying the ventral columns have only motor information. They may also transmit some sensory information, but to my understanding, they are primarily motor, versus the lateral are going to be motor and sensory. So I want you to just take a second and go back to this slide. Pause the video, see if you can answer this question using these vocabulary words. And then I'll show you your key takeaways. Okay, so here are your key takeaways for the spinal cord. First of all, you need to know that the 31 pairs of spinal nerves, it's actually more than 31 pairs if you include the cauda equina. But these spinal nerves from the spinal cord connect the PNS to the brain, and they enable reflexes. Second, you should know the spinal cord is protected from damage by the vertebral column, so that the bone, as well as the meninges. You also need to know that afferent impulses, meaning sensory impulses, come up the dorsal side, and that the cell bodies of sensory neurons in the dorsal root are in the dorsal root ganglia. You should know that efferent impulses go down the ventral side, and the cell bodies of the motor neurons in this case would be in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And last of all, damage to the spinal cord can cause paralysis, and that's something we'll address in class. Also, I just want to quickly say, between having damage to the parts of the nerves that are responsible for sensory information versus motor information, it's more crucial that you protect the motor tracts and the motor nerves, or and the reason is because you're able to survive better and longer if you have motor control, even if you have sensory damage or damage to your sensory nerve fibers. And so that is part of the reason why the ventral root, as well as the ventral white matter column, as well as back here, the ventral horns of the gray matter, they're all more protected by being more inside your body compared to the dorsal columns, the dorsal or posterior horns of the gray matter, the dorsal roots or dorsal root ganglia. Those are more exposed because they're closer to your backside.